Hank Crawford, a 15-year-old boy, has been living under the harsh rule of his cruel stepmother Carmen. Every day he's pushed to the brink, forced to work endlessly until his body can't take it anymore. But everything changes the moment Lucas Sterling, a millionaire, sees Hank in a heart-wrenching scene of abuse. Lucas, a stranger to Hank, steps into the storm and offers him a lifeline, an escape from the cold, heartless world he's been trapped in. Will this unexpected meeting give Hank the chance he desperately needs to change his life, or will his past continue to haunt him? Before we dive into the story, leave a comment below and let me know which city you are watching from. Let's get started. The air in Shattered Cove hung thick with salt and silence, the kind of heavy stillness that only the ocean could bring. As the darkening clouds rolled in from the horizon, the town stood like a forgotten relic of better days, its abandoned docks creaking under the weight of years left to rot. The houses once bustling with families and laughter now sagged under the burden of their own decay. But in the midst of the quiet, a storm raged inside Hank Crawford. At just 15, he had already learned the hard way that the world didn't care about him. There was no love to be found in Shattered Cove. No kindness to hold on to, only cold glares, and the sting of words sharp enough to draw blood. His life shaped by years of his stepmother's cruelty and his father's indifference had never been his own. Carmen Crawford. Hank's stepmother was a woman whose heart seemed to beat only for herself. She had come into their lives like a storm, sweeping away the remnants of Hank's mother's memory, taking over every corner of their home with a cold efficiency. Hank's father, Gregory Crawford, once a hard-working fisherman who had been known for his big dreams and even bigger heart, had turned into a shadow of the man he once was. Since his wife's death years ago, Gregory had numbed himself with alcohol, retreating to the local bar every evening, escaping into a world where Hank didn't exist, except when he needed a punch bag to release his frustrations. Hank was nothing more than an afterthought in his father's life, a mistake he had to tolerate, but one he had long given up on fixing. Carmen saw Hank only as an obstacle, a reminder of the family she never truly wanted. To her, the boy was a nuisance, a drain on her plans. She couldn't stand his presence, his quiet manner, his refusal to meet her gaze, the way his music played like a distant echo through the house, a subtle defiance against her control. Carmen's love had always been conditional, and Hank had never been able to meet her expectations. Instead of caring for him, she used every opportunity to belittle him, to remind him of his place. She made sure he knew without a shadow of a doubt that he wasn't wanted. Every snide remark, every harsh word, every broken promise to help him with his homework was a reminder of his inferiority. Hank had learned to keep his head down, to stay out of her way, but the damage was done. It was a Tuesday when the full weight of Hank's existence in that house came crashing down. The rain had started to pour that morning, heavy and unforgiving, as though the sky itself was angry. Hank had spent the morning doing chores, the same endless tasks he'd been assigned every day, scrubbing the kitchen floor, washing the dishes, picking up after Carmen's ever-growing mess. He had long since given up on hoping for a word of encouragement. His efforts went unnoticed, his silent plea for validation unanswered. In the quiet, his guitar had become his only solace, a way for him to escape into a world where he could be more than just Carmen's errand boy. But even that was a threat to her. She hated the way he played, the way the music seemed to fill the house with something she could never control. And so that afternoon, after Hank had spent hours in the rain, washing the windows of their dilapidated home, Carmen found her latest reason to lash out. It was over something as insignificant as a muddy footprint on the kitchen floor, something Hank hadn't even noticed. But Carmen, with her cruel precision, honed in on the smallest mistake, inflating it into something monstrous. She dragged Hank into the kitchen, her eyes flashing with fury. Her voice sliced through the silence of the house, sharp and venomous, each word a blow. How many times have I told you to keep this place clean, you worthless boy? You can't even keep a simple floor from getting dirty. Do you think I'll let you ruin my life? You're nothing but a stain, Hank. Nothing but a stain on everything I've worked for." Hank stood frozen, the familiar sting of her words ringing in his ears, but his shoulders hunched in resignation. He was used to this by now. He had learned early that he would never be enough for Carmen, no matter how hard he tried. He could hear his father's footsteps outside the door, the telltale sound of his boots hitting the wet ground as he made his way home from the bar, but Gregory never came to his rescue. Not now. Not ever. Carmen shoved Hank toward the door. "Get out! I don't want you in my house. Go hide somewhere out of my sight where I don't have to look at you. You're a burden." The rain was coming down in torrents, and the wind had picked up as if nature itself had joined in the punishment. Hank, barely feeling the cold anymore, wandered outside into the storm. His mind was a storm of its own, filled with anger and despair. His father. His stepmother. These were the people who were supposed to love him, but they didn't. They never had. He walked to the edge of the cliff, looking out over the sea. It was a vast, empty horizon that mirrored the emptiness in his chest. As the waves crashed violently against the rocks below, Hank's gaze softened. He pulled out his guitar, the only piece of comfort he had, and began to play. It was at that moment, as the rain lashed against his face, and the world seemed determined to swallow him whole, that a car pulled up behind him. Lucas Sterling stepped out of the sleek black vehicle, the rain glistening off his tailored suit. He had seen Hank's silhouette in the storm from his car, and for reasons he couldn't explain, felt compelled to stop. The moment he stepped into the downpour, it was as if the universe had conspired to bring them together. Lucas didn't speak immediately. Instead, he stood there for a long moment, taking in the scene before him, the teenage boy with his guitar alone in the world, soaked to the bone, as if the weight of all his burdens had become too much. Lucas had seen suffering before. He had known it had lived it, even if his wealth and success now hid the scars. He knew this boy's pain better than anyone. "What's your name?" Lucas asked, his voice steady and calm amidst the howling wind. "Hank," the boy muttered, his voice barely audible over the storm. "You don't have to be out here," Lucas said, his eyes narrowing as he took a step closer. "Get in the car. I'll take you somewhere warm." Hank didn't move. The words hung in the air, but his body was frozen, as though the cold had seeped into his very soul. Carmen's words echoed in his mind. "You're nothing but a stain." And yet this stranger, a man he had never met, was offering him something no one ever had: compassion. Lucas stood there for a moment, studying the boy, seeing the cracks in his armor. Then, without a word, he removed his coat and draped it over Hank's shivering shoulders. "Come on, let's get you out of the rain." As the warmth of the coat enveloped him, Hank looked up at Lucas, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he felt seen. He wasn't invisible anymore. This was the moment that would change everything. Lucas Sterling had no idea what he was getting into, but it didn't matter. The storm was just beginning, both inside Hank's heart and in the world they were about to step into. What Lucas didn't realize yet was that helping Hank would force him to confront the demons of his own past. And together, they would have to fight against a world that had been unkind to find the family that each had been longing for in places they never thought to look. But that was all still ahead of them. For now, the boy stood in front of him, trembling, but no longer alone. The warmth of Lucas's coat enveloped Hank, but the momentary comfort was fleeting. It wasn't just the rain that soaked Hank to the bone. It was the crushing weight of years of emotional neglect and abuse that lingered no matter how much warmth Lucas offered. As they walked toward the sleek Cadillac, Hank's heart was still racing. The last thing he expected was for someone to step in and offer him a lifeline. For so long he had felt invisible, a mere shadow in the corner of his own life. But Lucas had seen him, really seen him, and the boy didn't know how to process that. It felt too good to be true, and yet a flicker of hope sparked inside him. Lucas opened the car door, ushering Hank inside with a gentle push on his shoulder. It wasn't until they were on the road leaving the storm behind them that Hank dared to speak. "Why are you helping me?" Hank's voice cracked, betraying the vulnerability he usually tried so hard to conceal. It wasn't a question born out of disbelief, but one born of desperation. For all his life, people had let him down, and trust had become a foreign concept. His father Gregory, who had once promised to protect him, had long since abandoned him to the whims of his cruel stepmother. Carmen's harsh words and cold glares had become his everyday reality, a constant reminder of his worthlessness. Hank had learned to survive, but he had never dared to hope. Lucas glanced at him, his eyes reflecting a depth of understanding that made Hank's chest tighten. "I saw you out there," Lucas said softly, his voice a low rumble amidst the hum of the engine. "I saw the way she treated you, and I couldn't walk away. No one should ever be treated that way, Hank. No one." Hank turned his gaze out the window, watching the landscape blur as they sped through the rain. The storm was fading behind them, but the storm inside him felt as though it would never end. He knew that things wouldn't suddenly be better because of Lucas's kindness. Carmen had made sure of that. Every time Hank had tried to speak up to defend himself, she had slapped him back down with words that cut deeper than any physical blow. "You're nothing but a burden," she would say, "a mistake I have to tolerate until you're old enough to leave." The car ride felt like hours, though it was only a few minutes before Lucas turned onto a winding road that led into a large private estate. The gates, tall and imposing, opened with a quiet whir, and Lucas drove through them with an ease that made Hank's stomach knot. This wasn't his world. This was a world far removed from the grime and the harshness of Shattered Cove, where people like him barely existed. When the car came to a stop in front of a large, modern mansion, Hank didn't move at first. The grandeur of the place made him feel small, insignificant. How was he supposed to fit into a life like this? A life where people had everything they could ever need, while he had nothing but the remnants of a broken home. The place looked like a fortress, a beautiful, unapproachable fortress. "Come on, Hank," Lucas said, his voice warm and encouraging. "Let's get you inside and dry off." Hank followed Lucas into the house, his feet heavy with the weight of a life he didn't want, but couldn't escape. The mansion was pristine, the walls adorned with expensive artwork, and the furniture gleaming under the soft glow of recessed lighting. Hank felt like a fish out of water, his muddy shoes leaving tracks on the polished marble floors. He wanted to shrink to disappear into the shadows, but Lucas led him into a spacious living room and gestured for him to sit on the couch. "You're safe here, Hank," Lucas said as he disappeared into another room. The words were simple, but they felt like a lifeline to Hank, even though he wasn't sure how to hold on to it. He had never felt safe anywhere before. Not truly. Not when Carmen was constantly watching him, judging every move he made. Not when his father had forgotten how to care. Lucas returned with a towel, offering it to Hank, who accepted it without a word. He rubbed his face, trying to clear away the remnants of the storm and the fog that clouded his mind. The music from his guitar still echoed in his ears, a melody of sorrow and defiance that had become the soundtrack of his life. But now, in this strange, unfamiliar place, he was beginning to wonder if there could be something more, something better. As Hank dried off, Lucas sat across from him, watching him carefully. His presence was calm, but there was an intensity in his gaze that Hank couldn't ignore. It was the same kind of intensity that Lucas had shown when he stepped out of his car and saw Hank standing in the rain. It was the kind of intensity that made Hank feel seen, made him feel important for the first time in his life. But with that intensity came the feeling that things were about to change, and Hank didn't know if he was ready for that. "I know you've been through a lot," Lucas said after a long pause. "But you need to understand something. You don't have to live like that anymore. You don't have to take that kind of treatment. You deserve better, Hank." Hank's throat tightened, and for a moment he couldn't speak. The weight of Lucas's words hit him harder than he could have ever imagined. You deserve better. For so long, Hank had convinced himself that he wasn't worth anything. He had internalized the cruel words Carmen had said to him, the way she had made him feel like a shadow in his own home. But now Lucas was telling him something different. He was telling him that he was worthy of love, worthy of care, worthy of respect. "I don't know how to believe that," Hank whispered, his voice barely audible. "I've never been treated like I'm worth anything. I've only ever been in the way." Lucas leaned forward, his expression softening. "That's not true, Hank. You've been valuable all along, even when they couldn't see it. I see it, and I'm not going to let anyone treat you like that again." Hank's heart hammered in his chest, a mixture of anger and sadness rising inside him. How could he let someone like Lucas in? How could he trust someone who seemed so different from everyone else? But then, as he looked into Lucas's eyes, he saw sincerity, raw, unwavering sincerity. And for the first time, Hank felt like he could let someone in. He had been shutting people out for so long, but maybe it was time to stop hiding. The tension in the room thickened as Hank thought about everything he had left behind in Shattered Cove. The anger he had felt for so long began to boil beneath the surface, fueled by the injustice he had endured. He was angry at Carmen, at Gregory, at the whole world that had turned its back on him. He was angry that he had been made to feel small, like his very existence didn't matter. But more than that, he was angry at himself for letting it go on for so long, for allowing them to break him down piece by piece. "I'm not going back," Hank said suddenly, his voice firm and resolute. I can't live like that anymore. I won't let her win. I won't let them destroy me." Lucas's eyes shone with approval. "You don't have to go back, Hank. You've got a new chance now, a real chance, and I'll help you take it." Hank nodded, a flicker of hope igniting inside him. For the first time, he wasn't just a victim. He was a fighter. And he wasn't going to let the world or Carmen define him any longer. The road ahead would be hard, but Hank had someone in his corner now. And with that knowledge, the anger that had once threatened to consume him began to shift into something more powerful, a resolve to stand tall, to fight for himself, and to take control of his future. For the first time in his life, Hank felt ready to live. As the days passed in Lucas's home, Hank slowly began to shed the remnants of his old life. The mansion with its high ceilings and expansive rooms felt alien to him at first. But slowly it started to feel like a refuge, a place where he could breathe freely without the constant weight of fear and humiliation hanging over him. The first night after Lucas had shown him to a guest bedroom, Hank laid in bed staring at the ceiling, unsure of how to process the kindness he had been shown. He hadn't slept well in weeks, but that night something in his chest lightened for the first time in ages, and he drifted into an exhausted sleep. The next morning, Lucas had made pancakes, and Hank ate like he hadn't tasted food in years. It wasn't the food itself, it was the feeling of being cared for that had him overwhelmed. No one had ever cared enough to make him breakfast before. However deep inside, Hank still felt the pull of his past. The memory of Carmen's cruel face, her harsh words, her dismissive tone, they were all too fresh. He hadn't left Shattered Cove completely behind. His life there still loomed over him, even in the safety of Lucas's home. He had no idea how much longer he could keep pretending that the pain didn't follow him. He missed his father, Or the father he wished he had, Gregory, the man who had raised him, if only in the most neglectful way possible. His absence had left an indelible mark on Hank. But it wasn't just the neglect, it was the betrayal. Gregory had never stood up for him, never protected him from Carmen, never seen how much his son had endured. All of Hank's life had been spent under a shadow. It was Lucas, a stranger, who had become the one to show him what it was like to truly be seen. But as much as Hank wanted to embrace this newfound safety, he knew that there would always be a battle ahead. That battle came sooner than either of them expected. It was a Thursday afternoon when Hank received the phone call from the local police station. He had been sitting in the living room strumming his guitar when the ring of the phone shattered the stillness. He glanced at Lucas, who was on the other side of the room checking his email. Hank picked up the receiver, the weight of the call instantly pressing on his chest. Hank Crawford, the voice on the other end, asked. "Yeah, speaking," Hank said, his voice trembling slightly. "We've received a report about your whereabouts." The officer continued, his voice stern but professional. "Your stepmother, Carmen Crawford, is filing a missing persons report. She's claiming that you've been kidnapped." Hank froze. For a split second, his brain couldn't process what the officer had said. Kidnapped Carmen had made it clear from day one that she didn't want him. She had always treated him like a burden, an obstacle to her plans. The very idea of her calling him missing was laughable, and yet it made Hank's stomach churn with dread. He could feel his blood pressure rising, the panic bubbling up in his chest. The anger that had simmered within him for years was suddenly raging, ready to boil over. "What do you mean by missing person?" Hank finally managed to ask, his voice low and tight with emotion. "Your stepmother has called it in. She's trying to press charges for kidnapping, claiming that you're being held against your will. She's also mentioned that you've been living with someone else." The officer paused, and Hank could hear the sound of papers shuffling in the background. "We need you to come in for questioning. We're required to follow up on these reports." Hank's mind raced. Carmen had always been cruel, but to go this far to accuse him of kidnapping, she had no right to paint him as the victim. She was the one who had driven him to escape, the one who had made his life a living hell. His heart hammered against his chest as the officer's words lingered in his mind. What if she came for him? What if she dragged him back to that hellhole? "Is there anything you need to do before coming in?" Hank, the officer's voice, broke through his thoughts. "You're legally entitled to contact a lawyer if you need one." "I'm not coming in," Hank said, his voice gaining strength with each word. He gripped the receiver tighter, the weight of the decision heavy in his hand. "I'm not going back to her. I'm not going back to that place. You can't make me." There was a silence on the other end of the line. Then the officer spoke again. "I understand, Hank. But the situation's more complicated now. You may want to discuss this with a lawyer before things escalate further." As Hank hung up the phone, his thoughts swirled in a storm of anger and frustration. He could feel the heat rising in his chest, the injustice of it all burning in his veins. Carmen had never cared about him, never shown a shred of kindness, and now she was playing the victim, trying to twist the narrative, to make herself look like the one in danger. The injustice of it all was suffocating. He looked up to find Lucas watching him, his expression unreadable but calm. He could see the tension in Hank's shoulders, the tightening of his fists, and for the first time Hank realized just how much he had been holding in, how much rage had been festering in him for so long. The memories of Carmen's cruelty, of Gregory's neglect, they were all coming to the surface now. The feeling of being abandoned, of being pushed to the brink, was all too familiar. "You heard that, didn't you?" Hank asked, his voice shaking with fury. He didn't want to scream, but the words escaped him anyway. "She's going to get away with this. She's going to make it seem like I'm the one who's in the wrong. And she's been doing it for years." Lucas stepped closer. his presence a calming force amidst the chaos swirling inside Hank. "She won't get away with it," Lucas said, his voice firm and resolute. "Not while I'm here. We'll fight this, Hank. You don't have to do it alone." Hank could feel the weight of those words settle into his chest. He wasn't alone anymore. Lucas had become his protector, his ally in this fight for his freedom. For a moment, Hank's anger began to subside, replaced by a burning determination. He wasn't going to let Carmen tear him down any longer. He had a voice now. He had the power to stand up and fight back. That evening, Lucas called his lawyer, arranging a meeting to discuss the next steps. Hank spent the rest of the night preparing for what was to come. He knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Carmen would fight tooth and nail to keep him under her thumb, to make sure that she could continue controlling him from afar. But Hank had something now that he'd never had before: hope. And with Lucas by his side, he felt ready to face whatever was coming next. The next morning they sat in the lawyer's office, the air thick with anticipation. Hank's nerves were on edge, but Lucas was there sitting next to him, his presence grounding him. The lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Rachel Pierce, flipped through the legal documents with practiced ease. "We'll need to gather evidence to show that Carmen's claims are baseless," Rachel said, looking directly at Hank. "It's a good thing you've been keeping track of everything. Any photos, recordings, or testimonies you have will help." Hank nodded, trying to steady his racing thoughts. He had kept a journal, written down everything Carmen had done to him, her cruel words, her constant belittling, her violent outbursts. But would it be enough? Would anyone believe him when he said that he had lived in fear for years? When he said that he had been suffocated by the weight of her cruelty? He thought of his father, of how Gregory had always been absent, always turned a blind eye to Carmen's actions. That man had never been there for him. But now he had someone who would stand by him, someone who would fight for him. And as he looked at Lucas, Hank realized that this fight was no longer about proving himself to Carmen. It was about reclaiming his own life. As they left the lawyer's office, Lucas's hand rested firmly on Hank's shoulder. "We'll get through this," he said, his voice unwavering. "This is just the beginning. You're not alone in this fight, Hank. Not anymore." And in that moment, Hank knew he was right. The days after the lawyer's office felt like a blur, a whirl of legal papers, courtroom visits, and strategy sessions. Every moment was charged with tension, each step forward a battle, each setback a reminder of how much Hank had suffered before he had found his way into Lucas's care. The fight for Hank's future wasn't just about custody. It was about something far more profound. It was about taking back his voice, his dignity, and his place in the world, things that Carmen had tried to strip from him over the years. Yet, as the days wore on, Hank found himself gradually changing. The boy who had once cowered in silence was now beginning to speak, to stand firm. He was no longer afraid of the world that had once been so cold and hostile. The anger that had fueled him began to fade, replaced by something else, something stronger. Determination. Lucas had been a constant throughout it all, steadfast, calm, and focused. While Hank spent his days preparing for what was to come, trying to make sense of the whirlwind of emotions inside him, Lucas remained the pillar of strength that Hank had always needed. He had gone beyond being just a protector. He had become a mentor, a guide through a storm Hank had never anticipated. As they spent hours together preparing evidence, Lucas often found himself reminding Hank that his story mattered, that his pain, no matter how long it had been buried, was valid. Lucas had seen Hank's anger in those first moments, the way he had clenched his fists, the way his eyes had hardened when he had spoken about Carmen's abuse. But slowly, Lucas had noticed a change in him. Hank's anger no longer consumed him. It was as though it had been transformed into something more powerful, a quiet, steady resolve to reclaim the life he had lost. On the third day after the lawyers' meeting, Rachel Pierce had called them both into her office for an update. The news was far from good. Carmen had hired one of the most expensive defense attorneys in the region, and the accusations of kidnapping were only the beginning of what they'd have to face. The defense team was already working hard to paint Hank as a troubled child, someone who had fled his home for reasons other than the truth. Rachel explained how Carmen had fabricated details in her report, twisting Hank's behavior, and painting herself as the long-suffering stepmother who had tried to help, but had been rejected by a wayward child. "They'll try to discredit you, Hank." Rachel had set her eyes hard as she looked at him. "They'll say you're just running away from discipline, that you've got issues that have nothing to do with the way you've been treated. But we've got the truth on our side. All we need to do is show them who you really are." That night, as Hank lay in bed, he thought about the fight ahead. He thought about Carmen's cold eyes, the cruel things she had said to him, and how she had made him feel like he wasn't worth anything. He thought about the years spent in that suffocating house, the silence that had followed every insult, every slap, every harsh word. But there was a fire growing inside him now, a fire that burned with the certainty that he had a right to be heard. He wasn't going to let them silence him again. Not now. Not ever. For the first time in his life, Hank felt like he was in control. It wasn't because he had some grand plan, but because he had finally understood that he didn't need to carry the weight of Carmen's cruelty anymore. He didn't need to hide from his past. It was part of him, but it didn't have to define him. The boy who had been beaten down, emotionally abandoned, and left to fend for himself was no longer the same boy he had been just a few weeks ago. He had found something stronger than anger. He had found a sense of worth, of strength, that no one could take from him. The day of the preliminary hearing arrived sooner than expected. Lucas, Hank, and Rachel walked into the courtroom together, the weight of the legal battle bearing down on them. The room was cold, impersonal, filled with the sterile air of bureaucracy. There were reporters huddled in one corner, their cameras flashing with an almost predatory energy, eager for a story. Carmen sat in the front row, her face a mask of carefully crafted sorrow. She had come dressed in black, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes bright with the attention she had received from the press. Beside her sat her attorney, a sharp-looking man with a calm, practiced demeanor, whose eyes flickered with disdain as he glanced at Hank. Hank could feel his stomach churn as he stepped into the courtroom. He hated the way Carmen looked at him as though he were a thing to be discarded. But as they took their seats, Rachel's voice cut through the haze of his nerves. "Focus, Hank," she said quietly. "This is your moment. Remember who you are. We're here to show the truth." It felt surreal, like some kind of twisted dream where he was finally confronting the person who had made his life a nightmare. His hand clenched into a fist at his side, his knuckles turning white. He had never expected to be here to be facing Carmen in a room full of strangers with the world watching. But he was ready, and the truth he knew was on his side. The proceedings began with Carmen's defense attorney presenting his argument. His words were slick, polished, designed to make Hank look like a delinquent, a runaway who had simply abandoned his responsibilities. He painted a picture of a boy who had turned his back on his family, who had been coddled and spoiled by a well-meaning but ultimately naive stepmother. The lawyer spoke with authority, and for a moment Hank's heart sank. His mind raced as he remembered all the times Carmen had belittled him, all the times his father had failed to intervene. He could feel the weight of the past pressing down on him, but he refused to let it break him. Rachel rose to her feet, her voice calm but firm. She called Hank to the stand. As he stood up, he felt the eyes of the courtroom on him, the weight of every single person's judgment pressing down on his shoulders. But he took a deep breath, and as he stepped forward, he found that the anger he had once felt was gone. In its place was something else, something stronger. "I'm not a runaway." Hank began, his voice steady, but the words felt like they were cutting through years of silence. "I didn't leave because I wanted to. I left because I had no choice." The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Carmen's eyes flickered with disbelief, her carefully composed mask slipping for just a second. Hank continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I've been living in fear for years," he said, his eyes never leaving Carmen's. "I've been treated like I'm nothing, like I'm some kind of inconvenience. I'm not a bad kid. I'm just someone who wanted to survive." He could hear the tremor in his voice, but it wasn't fear. It was a realization that for the first time in his life, he was speaking the truth. He had nothing to hide. Carmen's cruelty could no longer keep him in the dark. As Hank spoke, Rachel's voice echoed through his mind. "This is your moment. The truth is yours to share, Hank. Let it be heard." And it was. The courtroom was silent, save for Hank's voice, and the truth he had carried for so long. When Hank finished, he stepped down from the stand, his legs unsteady, but his heart lighter than it had ever been. The judge, an older woman with sharp, calculating eyes, looked at Carmen with an expression of quiet disapproval. "The court has heard enough," she said. "We will deliberate and issue a ruling soon. Hank Crawford is hereby granted temporary protection while we continue to review the case." As they left the courtroom, Hank's heart pounded with an adrenaline he hadn't expected. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time in his life, he felt like he had done something right. He had stood up for himself, and the world had listened. That night, as they walked out of the courthouse, Lucas placed a hand on Hank's shoulder. "You did great," he said. "You were brave, Hank." And that's what matters. For the first time, Hank smiled, not just because Lucas had said the right thing, but because he believed it. For the first time, he felt truly free. The final day of the court proceedings arrived with a sense of finality that seemed to hang in the air, thick and oppressive. Hank stood outside the courthouse, feeling the cool autumn breeze rustle his jacket, the weight of the past few weeks pressing down on his chest. He had done everything he could. He had shared his truth, exposed the wounds that had festered in silence for so long, and now it was out of his hands. Lucas stood beside him, his presence a constant, steady reminder that Hank was not alone in this fight. He had found in Lucas not just a protector, but a guide, someone who believed in him when he couldn't believe in himself. And as they both entered the courthouse for the final hearing, Hank felt a sense of resolve wash over him. The battle had been long, and it had been hard, but it was almost over. Inside the courtroom, the usual quiet hum of hushed conversations filled the air. The tension was palpable as the judge took her seat at the front of the room, her eyes scanning over the paperwork in front of her. Hank's heart beat loudly in his chest, but he stood tall, his shoulders squared, knowing that this moment was a culmination of everything he had fought for. The defense attorney who had once so confidently tried to paint Hank as a runaway now sat quietly beside Carmen, who looked like a woman on the edge, her face pinched with anger and disbelief. Hank could feel her eyes on him, sharp and unforgiving, but he no longer flinched under her gaze. He had faced her for so long, endured her cruelty, but now he was no longer afraid. The judge called the court to order, her voice commanding the room's attention. "We have reviewed the evidence, heard testimonies, and considered all the factors in this case. The decision before this court today is one of great consequence for the future of young Hank Crawford." Hank glanced at Lucas, who gave him a small, encouraging nod. It wasn't just a nod of support. It was a nod that conveyed everything that had led them to this point. The countless hours spent preparing, the nights Hank had spent, wondering if this day would ever come, and the journey that had brought him here. He wasn't just standing in front of a judge today, he was standing in front of his future. And for the first time in his life, Hank felt the strength to face it. The court has determined, the judge continued, her voice stern and unyielding, that Hank Crawford will remain under the temporary guardianship of Lucas Sterling until a permanent arrangement is made. The court has found that Hank has been subjected to neglect and emotional abuse, and the evidence presented has shown that he has been in a harmful environment for too long. The words were a balm to Hank's soul, the relief almost overwhelming as the judge's declaration echoed in his ears. Carmen's face turned a shade of red that Hank had never seen before. Her jaw clenched tight as she glared at the judge. She stood up abruptly, her hand slamming onto the table, her voice rising in protest. "This isn't right," she shouted, her voice sharp and cutting through the tension. "He's my son. He belongs with me." But the judge did not flinch. "The court does not agree," she said firmly, her voice cutting through Carmen's protests like a knife. "Hank Crawford will remain with Mr. Sterling, and the court will continue to review the case to ensure that Hank's future is secure." Hank's breath caught in his chest as he realized what this meant. It was over. Carmen's hold over him had been shattered. The years of fear, the nights of uncertainty, the weight of her cruelty, they were all finally being undone piece by piece. For the first time in his life, Hank felt like he had a future that was his to shape. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was living. The gavel came down with a resounding thud, and the room erupted in murmurs, but Hank couldn't hear any of it. His mind was a blur of emotions, relief, anger, sadness, but most of all a deep sense of something he had never truly felt before: hope. It was the kind of hope that came with knowing that justice had been done, that the truth had prevailed, and that he could now begin to rebuild his life on his own terms. As the courtroom emptied, Hank stood beside Lucas, feeling a sense of peace settling over him. The battle had been long and grueling, but now it was over. For the first time, he could look forward instead of backward. And as he walked out of the courthouse, the weight that had carried him for so long began to lift piece by piece. The man who had been shaped by neglect, who had been broken by the world, was now free to create the life he had always dreamed of. Later that evening, Lucas invited Hank to dinner at a small, cozy restaurant. It was a quiet, unassuming place, but it was warm and inviting, the kind of place where you could feel at home, no matter where you came from. As they sat down at the table, Lucas smiled at Hank, the kind of smile that spoke volumes without a single word being said. "You did it, Hank," he said softly, his eyes filled with pride. "You're free now, and you've earned every bit of it." Hank looked down at his plate, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. It was strange, he thought, how much had changed in such a short time. Not just in his circumstances, but in himself. He had spent so much of his life afraid of Carmen's anger, afraid of what would happen if he spoke up, afraid of his own emotions. But now he felt different. The fear was still there, lurking in the back of his mind, but it wasn't the driving force anymore. His past no longer defined him. His future was his own, and it was filled with possibilities. "I still don't know what I'm doing," Hank said quietly, his voice laced with uncertainty. "I don't know how to be normal. How do I even start over?" Lucas's smile softened his gaze, full of understanding. "You don't have to know everything right now, Hank. You've taken the hardest step. The rest will come with time. You don't have to rush. Just take it one day at a time." For the first time in his life, Hank didn't feel the weight of the world on his shoulders. He didn't have to carry his pain, his anger, his regret anymore. It was still there, of course it would always be a part of him, but it wasn't who he was anymore. He wasn't defined by the years of abuse, the years of silence. He was defined by the fact that he had stood up and fought for himself. And that fight, that courage, was something that no one could ever take from him. As they finished their meal and headed back to the car, Hank couldn't help but feel a sense of peace settling over him. It was a peace he had never known before, a peace that came from knowing he had found someone who cared, someone who believed in him. Lucas wasn't just a guardian, he was family. And in that moment, Hank realized something else. He had never truly been alone. Not really. He had always had the strength to survive even when he didn't know it. As they drove home, Hank looked out the window at the darkened streets, the city lights flickering in the distance. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he was excited to find out. The world was wide open, and he was finally free to walk through it on his own terms. When they arrived at Lucas's home, Hank stood for a moment looking up at the house that had become his sanctuary. It was no longer just a place where he was hiding. It was a place where he could truly live. And for the first time, he felt like he belonged. "I don't think I'll ever be able to thank you enough," Hank said quietly, his voice filled with sincerity. Lucas looked down at him, a faint smile on his face. "You don't have to. You've already done it. By being who you are." Hank smiled back, his heart lighter than it had ever been. He wasn't alone anymore. And for the first time in his life, he felt like he had a family. This was just the beginning. And it was enough. The lesson learned from Hank's journey is simple, yet profound. No one should ever let fear define who they are or what they can become. Throughout his life, Hank was told he wasn't enough by his stepmother, his father, and even by himself. He believed the cruel things people said to him, internalizing those words as his reality. But in the end, Hank learned that he had the power to define himself. It wasn't the circumstances he was born into, nor the pain he had endured that determined his worth. It was his courage to speak up, his decision to seek a better life, and his willingness to fight for his future that reshaped his story. This story isn't just about Hank. It's about all of us. We all have moments in life where we feel helpless, where others might make us feel invisible or unimportant. But just like Hank, we have the ability to stand up, confront our past, and carve out a future filled with hope, strength, and purpose. The power of self-belief and asking for help when needed cannot be overstated. No one should have to carry the weight of their struggles alone. If Hank can break free from a life of abuse and neglect, so can anyone. And it doesn't take a superhero to make the change. It just takes one person to believe in you, and sometimes that person is you. To everyone reading this, never let anyone dictate your worth. No matter the obstacles, no matter the setbacks, you have the strength to overcome them. Life will throw challenges your way, but you have the ability to rise above them. And remember, asking for help is not a weakness. It's an act of courage. Whether it's a mentor, a friend, or a professional, never hesitate to reach out. You're not meant to carry your burdens alone. You deserve happiness, you deserve peace, and you deserve to live a life filled with purpose. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever been in a situation where you felt like you were being silenced or made to feel small? How did you overcome it? What helped you realize your strength? Please share your stories and reflections in the comments below, and let's support each other as we all strive to build better, more fulfilling lives. Thank you for reading, for being part of this journey, and for believing that every story, no matter how difficult, can lead to a brighter tomorrow.